everybody, it's Clarke Camper with the January 2013 edition of Wall Street and Washington. Today I'd like to do something a little different, and that is focus on one particular topic, and that topic is, you probably guessed it, the fiscal cliff and its aftermath. Now, I don't want to talk about this topic any more than you probably want to hear about it, but we would be remiss not to look at this episode because it provides us some real powerful takeaways in terms of what we can expect out of Washington in coming months. Now, in talking about the fiscal cliff, I want to touch on three areas. One is I'd like to talk about what's not in the bill, because there's been a lot of coverage about what's in it, but I'd like to talk about what was not in the agreement. Second, I'd like to talk about why we got to this place where political partisanship is so toxic that it prevents bipartisan agreement. And third, then I'd like to go to the question of what we can expect out of Washington in coming months. Now, in terms of what's not in the fiscal cliff agreement, there are three things that I want to highlight. First is debt ceiling. The Treasury Department tells us that by late February of 2013, the U.S. will reach the debt ceiling or our credit limit, and we will be unable to pay our bills unless Congress acts prior to that point. Second thing that's not in the fiscal cliff agreement is anything related to the automatic spending cuts known as sequestration, other than merely to postpone the time at which those cuts come into place from early January to early March of 2013. The third thing that was not in the fiscal cliff agreement is anything that addresses ongoing federal spending. Currently, under current law, the federal government runs out of money after March 27. In other words, we will have a government shutdown after March 27 if Congress doesn't act to continue spending beyond that point. So those three items are all coming back. As some people have said, the fiscal cliff is halftime. We have yet to play the second half of the game. I personally think fiscal cliff is more like maybe the first quarter, and we've got 3 more quarters to go, as you could see by my listing of items. I do want to mention there's a more macro issue that was not addressed and is also hanging out there, and that's much more comprehensive tax reform, and I'll return to that in a moment. But let's take a moment before we look at what we can expect in coming months to say, how did we get here? Why are we at this place where partisanship is so toxic that compromise is more than just a dirty word? It seems unachievable for all practical purposes. Now, particularly focusing in on the House, because that's the body that has displayed this toxicity to the most extreme degree recently. I think there are really two drivers that have brought us to this particular place. The first is redistricting. As viewers probably know, redistricting is done every 10 years at the state and local level. And what's happened over the last several decades in particular is that through that redistricting process, the number of seats that are very safe Democrat or very safe Republican have increased enormously. In fact, by some analyses, the number of seats where basically a Democrat is virtually certain to be elected or a Republican is virtually certain to be elected have doubled over the last 2 decades. What that also brings us to is other analyses have said that those kinds of safe Democrat, safe Republican seats together would account for more than half the seats in the House. In other words, more than half of the 435 seats are ultra-safe party seats. As you can imagine, if you're a member in one of those seats, all the incentives are to play to your constituent base, to play to your party base. In fact, the incentives are not to step out of line and vote for compromise, because you actually may be penalized, if not by your constituents, but by your party apparatuses. But so that's one very powerful factor that has brought us to where we are. Second piece, though, that I think that is underlooked is something that was very, very helpful in past years to create bipartisan compromise, and that is earmarks. Over the last few years, both the House and the Senate have prohibited the use of earmarks, and those are the specific directions that the federal government is to spend a certain amount of money on a particular project. So, for instance, a member may want a dam or a highway project or a nonprofit organization funded in their particular district. In the past, the leadership in either the House and the Senate could go to that member and say, look, I know you don't want to be with me on this compromise measure, but will you do it if I give you funding for your federal dam? And the way that it used to work was that members oftentimes would acquiesce and would go for the bipartisan measure without that incentive, without earmarks permitted anymore. Again, we have a situation where leadership oftentimes has very few tools to try to get those very strong Democrat or Republican member seats to vote for compromise. So with that as a background to where we are, let's look at what we can expect in the next couple months. As I mentioned already, there are 3 particular items that are coming up shortly, and I think that what we can expect is some version of the fiscal cliff in each of those cases. In other words, with regard to the debt ceiling, with regard to sequestration, with regard to federal spending. At the end of the day, Congress is going to come to an agreement on it, but it's going to be ugly. The drama will be great. The media will hype up the drama. The markets will obviously see that and do what they do, but the bottom line is I think we should expect that what you saw is just a prelude to what you're going to continue to see. Again, I personally think at the end of the day Congress comes to agreement on those matters, but as I say, it's going to be ugly. Now, I feel differently with regard to the more macro tax reform that I mentioned earlier. I think that requires such a level of much more extreme bipartisanship, shall we say, that I am not optimistic that Congress will be able to come to some kind of meaningful tax or entitlement reform going forward. Finally, in terms of something else to watch going forward, I think a very interesting development was the role of Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader from Kentucky. Many people believe without McConnell's involvement, we would have had no fiscal cliff agreement. That, in other words, the House was unable to actually move forward and come to compromise, and that again, McConnell jumping in and being able to negotiate with the administration and Senate Democrats and bring the vast majority of his caucus with him was what made the deal happen. I think that we'll see more of the same going forward. Any deal on any of the topics that I've mentioned is not going to happen without at least the acquiescence, if not the full support, of Senator McConnell. So with that, let's wrap things up, and I'll see you next month on Wall Street in Washington.